If you're trying to buy a high-end 50 series card, you might be wondering, is it worth spending more on the 5080, and if so, by how much? Especially given the fact that pricing on GPUs right now and their availability is absolutely crazy. So if you happen to spy a good deal on one or the other, how much does it matter which one it is? And if you're just going to bite the bullet and buy something, how much more is it reasonable to spend on a 5080 compared to a 5070 Ti? Again, this is complicated because their MSRPs are basically meaningless at this point. In the vast majority of my tests, we're going to look at a ton of side-by-sides, but if you average out all of my test results, the 5080 comes out 14% faster on average. If you prefer to see it in like best performance to worst performance, it's like anywhere from 4 to 21% faster, with 14 or 15% being pretty typical. That's, again, also the geo mean is 14%. If you want to make sure you're eliminating any like 1080p CPU limited results and just look at 4K results, again, the geo mean is about 14% faster. So while we are going to look at tons of side-by-sides to see what does that actually mean in gaming, we can now immediately switch over to a value comparison analysis. Because, for example, if you're looking at this at what price could I buy it for today at the time of filming, if I use a tool like PC Part Picker to sort a ton of different websites that sell GPUs for what's actually available in stock right now, of the 5080, the lowest price I can find is $1,800. Not that the 5070 Ti is much better. The lowest price I'm seeing here is $1,450. And again, they go up from there. If you divide those, you can see that right now you would be spending about 24% more money on the 5080. So if we're basing it on what's actually available in stock right now pricing, the 5080 is a worse deal. Again, we'll use a ton of side-by-sides in real gaming situations to figure out, is that still worth it though? Does it give you a meaningfully better experience on the 5080? In other words, what does 14% more performance actually look like from a real-world gaming situation? If you'd rather evaluate this at MSRP, and maybe if you're watching this video in the future and prices have settled down, it's actually a worse deal for the 5080. Because with a $1,000 MSRP for the 5080 versus a $750 MSRP on the 5070 Ti, again, these prices aren't really available right now, but maybe you're watching this at a point in time where they are, or maybe you're luckily able to grab one of them when the few MSRP models go in stock. That's actually a 33% more cost for the 5080. So again, spending 33% more money for 14% more performance. So we can answer right now, both in real-world pricing and at MSRPs, the 5070 Ti is better value. But is it worth getting that extra 14% performance? That's where I'm going to kind of slide off to the side over here, and we're going to run through a bunch of real-world gaming scenarios and look at what this actually means. First thing I'll test out here is what if you're planning on using these for 4K path tracing with all of the features, using the new transformer model of DLSS to use performance mode upscaling. You're kicking on ×4 frame gen. Well, here we're seeing that the 5070 Ti reaches 161 frames presented to your display. Only one out of every 4 of them is in a rendered frame. And we should talk about latency real quick before this ends. So that does affect latency. The 5080 is hitting 183 FPS, so even in this mode, it's 14% more frames on the screen. I'm also showing latency counters right here. And so you can see that the 14% more performance also translates to a few milliseconds less latency. If you go through this, it kind of varies. Sometimes it's as far apart as like 10 milliseconds. Other times it's closer like 5 milliseconds. Kind of varies throughout the benchmark run. But the point is you get a little bit more responsive of experience. But again, I don't think this is a transformatively different experience on the 5080 versus the 5070 Ti. Frankly, I'd say they're both a little borderline for people who are a little picky about the input responsiveness. Because if we actually turn off all the frame gen, but keep on DLSS performance upscaling, you can see that the baseline frame rates were 52 and 63 respectively. Actually, this is the 5080's biggest lead I have in all of the benchmarks I ran today, giving it a 21% advantage. But again, enabling frame gen has its own performance cost, and while the average for the 5080 is above 60, there are moments within the gameplay that are below 60 FPS, so I would say for a lot of people, this is going to be a usable experience from which to generate frames. For other people who are more picky on input responsiveness, it's a bit a bit borderline. It's really hard to review frame generation because it's a very personal experience on what you find acceptable and what kind of image quality artifacts and latencies are acceptable to you. Anyway, so the 5080 is better at 4K path tracing, although not wildly so. Now, what if you're using these GPUs at 1440p? Now, at native 1440p resolution, neither of them are actually capable of a great path tracing experience. We're seeing 40 FPS versus 35. So it's another case where it's not like the extra 14% performance suddenly makes this a native 1440p path tracing GPU. And if we go ahead and jump over to what if we kick on DLSS quality, well, now both of them, I think, actually are doing a reasonably good job here. We're at 64 FPS versus 73. Again, the 5080 is 14% faster. But again, one's a little over 60 FPS, the other one's a little over 70 FPS. Definitely a better experience on the 5080, but I wouldn't say wildly so. So it really, again, kind of depends on how much are those extra hundreds of dollars in the current market really worth it to you? Is it opening up a brand new experience? I would say they are both capable of 1440p RT overdrive, DLSS quality. And if you then try to kick on ×4 frame generation from there, it means the 5070 Ti is hitting just under 200 FPS and the 5080 is hitting 227 FPS. That's a 15% advantage in this test. Again, the responsiveness of that is better represented by the latency figures here, which are usually below 50 milliseconds, kind of bouncing around in the upper 30s, mid 40s, depends on the exact scene. And yeah, the 5080 has a few less milliseconds of latency. So again, 5080 is a better experience, but I wouldn't say one of these is wildly different than the other. If you're thinking about saving a little money, or a 5070 Ti pops up on the market available, and you're like, ooh, should I get that? Just to stress how difficult path tracing is, though, trying to run 1080p path tracing RT overdrive mode in Cyberpunk, both of them are just either a little below or a little above 60 FPS here. So the 5070 Ti hitting 55 and the 5080 hitting 64. Now, let's go ahead and check out some other games. So this is a game where, unlike Cyberpunk, you can't turn off ray tracing. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle always does use ray tracing. However, as long as you don't go into the full path tracing mode, the Supreme mode does actually run pretty well here. We're looking at 83 FPS versus 92, giving the 5080 an 11% advantage. Notice this is native 4K, no upscaling, and we're hitting very good frame rates at these settings. So, good experience on both of them. Again, 92 is better than 83, but I would say both of them are getting you a good 4K experience in this game at its maximum non-path tracing settings. If we're looking at 1440p Supreme settings, we're now looking at 127 FPS versus 138. The 5080 is 9% faster, but again, it's not a wildly different experience. So again, might want to think about saving a little money there. The latency counter in this game doesn't seem to be working. Maybe it doesn't have reflex tags implemented properly or something like that. Anyway, let's move on to an Unreal Engine 5 showcase. This is also one of the few Unreal Engine 5 games on PC that offers hardware accelerated ray tracing support. So if we turn that on, along with its epic settings, but use DLSS performance, frame rates are at 79 and 88. It's an 11% advantage for the 5080. But again, not like the 5070 Ti is at a wildly different experience there at 79 FPS average. If we go to 1440p epic settings ray tracing on and try to run it at native resolution, the 5070 Ti is hitting 65 FPS, which in a slow-paced game like this is pretty good. And the 5080 is 18% faster, hitting 77 FPS, so it is a better experience. But again, both of them pretty good for 1440p max settings in this game. And if you do kick on DLSS quality, they're both getting you a pretty high refresh rate experience at 91 and 101 respectively. 5080 is 11% faster. At 1440p epic settings, we're getting 84 FPS versus 94, 12% lead for the 5080. Again, this is epic settings, but with ray tracing turned off. So it still uses software-based Lumen, but turned off the hardware-accelerated ray tracing. If we jump over to another Unreal Engine 5 graphical showcase with Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga, the high settings in this game are the highest setting. There is nothing above that. There's no Ultra or Epic. There's also no hardware RT support for the game. We can see that at native 4K, it's a bit demanding, 44 versus 51 FPS. I don't think either GPU is probably where you would stop here. You'd probably at least use DLSS quality. it is a 16% advantage for the 5080. If we kick on DLSS quality, it's now a 12% lead for the 5080 at 82 FPS versus 73. So again, better experience on the 5080, but 73 FPS on the 5070 Ti is perfectly good for this slow paced of a game. If we go to 1440p max settings, it's 74 FPS versus 84, 14% advantage for the 5080. And yes, it's a better experience, but again, I don't think you'd have too many issues here. Also note that all my 50 series cards in this game are at native resolution, showing way more aliasing than they should. Even using the same driver, my 30 and 40 series cards are not showing this graphical anomaly. So just warning you guys that I am seeing that graphical issue on 50 series cards in this game. It goes away when you're using DLSS, but at the TSR settings, I am seeing that. Anyway, let's jump into Final Fantasy 16 at 4K Ultra. This is a very demanding game. Neither GPU is over 60 FPS average at 47 versus 53, 13% advantage for the 5080. So again, I don't think either GPU is quite where I would want it to be to try to max it out at 4K native res. If you go to DLSS performance, we're now hitting 93 FPS and 106 FPS. So the 5080 is 14% faster, but again, getting a high refresh rate experience on the 5070 Ti as well. At 1440p ultra settings, the 5080 is hitting 92, and the 5070 Ti is hitting 80, 15% lead for the 5080. But again, say for this style of single-player game that honestly, there's a good chance you might even play it with a controller or something, 80 FPS is a good experience here, and that's without any upscaling or anything, and it's max settings in the game. Switching over to God of War Ragnarok, 4K Ultra, no upscaling, max settings the game offers. We're looking at 73 FPS versus 85, 16% lead for the 5080, but I don't think anybody would argue that the 5070 Ti is putting up a bad experience here. And if you use DLSS quality, both GPUs offer a nice high refresh rate for single-player type game frame rates, 100 FPS versus 118. 18% lead for the 5080, so one of the bigger leads we've seen here. But again, I don't think 100 FPS at 4K Ultra DLSS quality, again, another game you might be playing on a controller, I think that'll feel pretty good on the 5070 Ti as well. Horizon Forbidden West, 4K very high, which is the max settings the game has to offer. 65 FPS on the 5070 Ti versus 75 on the 5080. It's a 15% lead for the 5080, both offering a good experience, and maybe on the 5080 I'd be less likely to feel the need to kick on DLSS. However, honestly, DLSS quality looks very good and gets enough performance boost. I probably would actually turn it on both GPUs, meaning now we're hitting 97 and 112 FPS respectively, so 15% more performance on the 5080. But again, 97 FPS on the 5070 Ti at these settings. You're still very much enjoying this experience. 1440p very high settings, no upscaling. It's 130 versus 112. Good experience on both. The 5080 is 16% faster. Ghost of Tsushima, 4K very high. We're talking 75 versus 65 FPS, 15% lead for the 5080. Both are giving you a good experience. It is better on the 5080, but once again, at 4K, I would usually kick on DLSS quality for the massive performance boost and still looking pretty good. In this case, we're now hitting 103 FPS versus 119. It's a 16% lead for the 5080, but again, you're getting 103 FPS on the 5070 Ti, so you're still very much having a good experience in the game. If we look at 1440p very high settings, we're getting 130 FPS versus 112, 16% lead for the 5080, but again, I'd say very good experience on both GPUs. I want to check out at least one more multiplayer-focused game, and with graphics settings turned down. Notice this is basic settings, but at 4K resolution. Again, a lot of times in competitive online games, people will turn down graphics settings for both a frame rate advantage as well as to declutter the environment, make sure you're not having enemies hiding behind foliage and things like that disappear at lower settings. Anyway, we're seeing a 9% lead for the 5080 here at 145 FPS versus 133. You could easily turn on upscaling and things like that as well. But if we drop down to 1440p resolution, we're seeing at 237 FPS versus 224. It drops to a 6% lead for the 5080, although there are at times in the benchmark run where it is potentially showing some system/CPU limitation. The GPUs aren't always pegged right at 99% utilization, although it is still mostly GPU limited at this point. If we drop down to 1080p, we're getting 303 versus 292, 4% lead for the 5080, and the amount of time that we spend somewhat system limited is expanding here. So again, just kind of running into some CPU limitations on many sections of this test, reducing the 5080's advantage. All right, that's the overall tests that I ran. And again, we did have some benchmarks to sum it up. But in the end, I'm trying to answer the question, is it worth spending more money on the 5080? Well, like I said, both at MSRP and at the current real world pricing at the time of filming this video, the value is better on the 5070 Ti. The 5080 is about 14% faster, but spending 24% more at real world pricing or 33% more on MSRP pricing, certainly getting you worse value. Again, sometimes it's worth paying, more per frame if it opens up brand new experiences that the other GPU just couldn't do. And I'll be honest, in the vast majority of tests that we just looked at here, both GPUs deliver an excellent experience in pretty much every game. The most demanding tests that I ran here were path tracing tests, which I use Cyberpunk to represent. And honestly, if you're using 1440p display, RT overdrive, DLSS quality, this is where I'd say in path tracing, every little bit of performance counts. However, if you went down to, DLSS balanced or something like that on the 5070 Ti, or if you're not too picky about frame generation, I think the 5070 Ti is still offering a reasonable experience here as well, if maybe not ideal. I'd say both GPUs are a little weaker than I would like for 4K path tracing, although again, I think a lot of people will find that experience usable on both of them, although more so on the 5080, again, especially if you are a fan of frame generation. Now, so basically I would say in the vast majority of situations, both GPUs offer such a good experience, or when they don't, you have to kick on DLSS on both, and then they both offer such a good, a similar enough frame rate, that personally, I would say the 5070 Ti offers you a card where, especially if you're playing at 1440p, it is kind of it can do everything pretty well card. The 5080 does everything about 14% better, but costs a lot more than that. So I'm not saying it's really opening up a lot of brand new experiences that the 5070 Ti can't. So I would say the more value-conscious buyer should probably focus on the 5070 Ti. However, at current pricing, this isn't really, none of this is good value. So if you're more in like hey, if I happen to spot one of the lower price models go in stock on a 5070 Ti, but I actually wanted a 5080, but this one's available for a split second, I would say don't be afraid of, if you were planning on getting a 5080, getting the 5070 Ti instead. Like I said, it's not a massive difference in the real world experience you're getting in either game, in any of the games I tested here. All right, that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully this helps, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.